Erik stood on the fjord's black shore as the sky burned with strange fire, and the narrator spoke of an oath older than iron. Edda said, "The red veil means a crown will fall, and a vow will break." Leif said, "Storms coming, Erik, and not from the sea." Erik answered, "A vow kept in silence still binds the heart." Sigrid drew close, and the narrator marked her smile like a blade hidden in velvet. Sigrid said, "Trust the path I show, and you will be welcomed again." Edda said, "Paths made by shadows lead to the grave." Drums rolled from Hakon's hall, and the narrator told of a feast that tasted of iron. Hakon said, "Exile ends when the kneeling begins." Erik said, "I kneel to no oathbreaker." The narrator set the shock. A horn blast, a murdered scout at Erik's feet, and a torn banner dripping red. Edda said, "Prophecy bites the hand that feeds it." Erik said, "Then I will feed it my silence and my steel." Dawn crawled over the fjord like a wounded thing, and the narrator weighed silence against survival. Erik said, "Blood on the banner means blood on the road." Edda said, "The road is a mouth. Feed it wisely." Leif said, "Tracks run north toward the ridge." Erik studied the broken fibers and the crushed reeds, and the narrator placed a question in his chest. Sigrid said, "Hakon will call you coward if you turn away." Erik said, "Hakon calls courage whatever kneels." The narrator held the wind as it carried the horn's echo into the trees. Edda said, "Choose what you can carry, not what carries you." Erik bound the banner, and the narrator sealed a vow behind his teeth. Leif said, "Then we climb before the hill wakes." The ridge rose like a spine, and the narrator counted footprints that lied about their number. Leif said, "Two go light, one drags a wound." Edda said, "Pain at its truth, but not direction." Erik said, "North still." A crow barked, and the narrator remembered halls where laughter hid knives. Sigrid said, "If we reach first, we set the tail." Erik said, "Tails bend to steel." The path narrowed, and the narrator felt stone scrape leather as the cliff leaned close. Edda said, "Listen for the hollow under the snow." Leif tapped the crust and a pocket sighed, and the narrator warned of hidden throats. Erik said, "Step where I step." They crossed the brittle lip, and the ridge kept its secrets. Smoke fingers lifted from a hollow, and the narrator tasted meat and fear. Leif said, "Camp below." Erik said, "We take eyes, not throats." Edda said, "Mercy buys time when silver fails." Sigrid said, "Mercy buys enemies." Erik said, "Then let them spend it." The hollow opened to a ring of stones, and the narrator placed 3 figures around a kettle like points on a snare. Leif said, "I circle right." Erik said, "I speak first." Edda said, "Let the old words open the door." Erik stepped into light, and the narrator felt the air dip as hands found hilts. Erik said, "Lay down blades. Share heat, trade news." The silence cracked, and the ring listened. The raiders' leader tilted his head, and the narrator counted the scars that argued with his pride. Erik said, "A scout died near the reeds." "Whose banner did you tear?" Raider said, "Wolf hunts wolf." Edda said, "Answer straight and walk away alive." Raider glanced at Leif, and the narrator measured fear in the twitch of a thumb. Leif said, "Your prints point north. What waits there?" Raider said, "Not mine to name." Sigrid's name drifted like smoke in Erik's mind, and the narrator tightened the knot. Erik said, "Then name who sent you." Raider said, "Hakon drinks early." The kettle boiled over, and the narrator poured the truth into the snow. Erik led the group into a valley where mist clung to the ground, and the narrator weighed every silence he carried. Leif said, "The prints vanish here, swallowed by stone." Erik said, "Stone remembers longer than flesh." Edda touched the earth and whispered, "Blood sits under this soil, and it is not yet cold." Sigrid walked close, her eyes sharp, and the narrator measured the weight of her gaze. Sigrid said, "This path draws us toward the hall, whether we wish it or not." Erik said, "Then let it draw steel before fear." The valley wind carried the sound of hidden rivers, and the narrator set unease into every step. Leif said, "I smell smoke though no fire burns." Erik said, "Smoke of war travels faster than fire." The silence pressed down, and the narrator tied the weight of exile to Erik's chest again. The narrator cast shadows across a ruined shrine of old gods, their faces carved into stone but half broken. Edda said, "Their mouths are shattered, so no prayers reach." Erik said, "Yet their silence holds more honor than Hakon's voice." Leif brushed snow from a fallen pillar and muttered, "Axes did this, not time." The narrator weighed the loss of faith against the hunger of power. Sigrid stepped closer, her hand trailing the cracks, and said, "When gods fall, men rise crueler." Erik answered, "When men rise crueler, oaths bind tighter." The wind whistled through the hollow, and the narrator let it sound. "Like morning," Edda said, "honor grows where loss is watered." Erik stared into the broken eyes of stone, and the narrator burned the vow deeper in silence. The narrator carried them into a forest dark with pine, where the canopy choked the day. Leif said, "No bird sings here, and no beast hunts." Erik said, "Places kept empty are not empty by chance." Edda's staff tapped roots, and she whispered, "The ground is hollow with secrets." Sigrid's eyes shifted, catching what the narrator knew was unease. Sigrid said, "Every shadow stretches like a snare." Erik said, "Then walk like prey that knows its hunter." Branches creaked as if voices whispered, and the narrator turned each sound into warning. Leif muttered, "Even the snow fears to fall here." Erik said, "Fear is a cloak, we wear it or it wears us." The forest swallowed them whole, and the narrator tightened the silence like a noose. They reached a clearing ringed with bones, and the narrator set fear into the marrow of silence. Leif said, "These are no feast bones, but offerings." Edda said, "The land takes tribute when men forget its price." Erik studied the circle, eyes hard, and said, "Hakon leaves his shadow even in places he does not tread." Sigrid's voice sharpened, "Or others leave it for him." The narrator placed a question between them, heavy as iron. Leif kicked ash and found blackened runes. Erik said, "A warning or a map?" Edda whispered, "Sometimes both." The fire pit's ashes swirled as wind cut through, and the narrator marked how uneasy braided with resolve. Erik said, "We carry no tribute but steel." Night deepened, and the narrator pressed stars into the sky like watchful eyes. Erik sat by a hidden fire, and silence stretched long. Leif said, "Every step north binds us tighter to war." Erik said, "War binds less than shame." Edda stirred coals, whispering, "Even fire dies when not fed." Sigrid's gaze flickered, catching Erik's eyes before she looked away. Sigrid said, "A vow kept in silence burns hotter than flame." Erik said, "Then let it burn, for flame lights the blade." The narrator let the crack of timber echo like prophecy. Leif said, "Do you still dream of the hall?" Erik said, "I dream of its fall." The night closed tight, and the narrator sealed Act 2 with unbroken silence. The narrator opened Act 3 with the sound of iron striking iron deep inside the valley, where echoes lingered like voices of the dead. Erik said, "Hakon sharpens war not for enemies, but for his own kin." Leif tightened his grip and muttered, "He readies more than steel. He readies betrayal." Edda raised her staff toward the peaks and whispered, "The mountain keeps secrets that men forget." Sigrid's eyes lingered on the horizon, and the narrator caught the weight of her silence. Sigrid said, "Every oath has two faces, and tonight you will see both." Erik looked at her sharply, and the narrator bound suspicion between them. Leif said, Do we march toward their forge or away from it? Erik said, toward. For silence means nothing if not carried into their fire. The narrator laid the valley path underfoot, dark and heavy, as their breath smoked in the way. Growing cold, the narrator carried them into a cavern mouth where the air tasted of soot and secrets. Erik said, "No forge sings this loud without blood close by." Leif scanned the ground and muttered, "Tracks lead in, none lead out." Edda said, "Smoke hides more than fire. It hides shame." Sigrid stood still, her eyes fixed on shadows deeper within, and the narrator framed her silence like a blade's edge. Erik said, "We move, but we move as wolves, not sheep." The sound of chains echoed faintly, and the narrator revealed the truth of captives in Hakon's grip. Leif said, "If he bends them, he bends the whole valley." Erik said, "Then we break his grip before it bends us." Edda whispered, "Even wolves choke on their own hunger." The narrator sealed unease in the glow of the cavern's maw. Inside the cavern, the narrator traced rows of chained men whose eyes reflected the forge like dying stars. Erik said, "Hakon feeds his throne with stolen breath." Leif's voice shook as he whispered, "They are warriors." Voice shook as he whispered, "Broken and bent." Edda said, "Chains bite deeper than steel. They bite the soul." Sigrid stepped close, her gaze unreadable, and said, "Chains can be cut, but not without noise." Erik said, "Then let noise carry truth instead of silence." The clang of hammers struck again, and the narrator wove the sound with the weight of betrayal. Leif said, "How do we free them before the guard strikes?" Erik said, "We free them by striking first." The narrator set the forge fire high, throwing shadows across stone and burning doubt into every eye. The narrator painted sudden steel as guards stepped from the shadows, eyes like wolves. Erik said, "Now we break the silence." Leif lunged forward, spear flashing, and shouted for the vow. Edda said, "Let wisdom guide steel before rage blinds it." Sigrid's blade slipped free, glinting sharp, and the narrator marked the edge of her loyalty with doubt. Sigrid said, "Blood makes truth clearer than words." Erik struck down the first guard, his vow burning in silence. The clang of steel filled the cavern, and the narrator bound noise into prophecy. Leif said, "We cannot hold forever." Erik said, "Then we cut chains and turn captives into storm." The narrator spun smoke and fire until the cavern roared with vengeance. The narrator closed Act 3 with chains shattering under Erik's blade, sparks rising like stars. Erik said, "Stand and your breath is your own again." A captive staggered free, whispering, "The vow lives." Leif pulled another upright, shouting, "Fight with us, not for him." Edda said, "Freedom weighs heavy, yet it lifts more than chains." Sigrid's eyes narrowed, her voice low. "Freedom also breeds war." Erik said, "Then war will carry truth louder than silence." The narrator let the cavern shake with the cry of freed men. Captives raised broken chains like banners, and the narrator sealed the moment as the birth of storm. Erik said, "Hakon's forge will burn his own throne." The vow burned brighter, and Act 3 ended in fire. The narrator opened Act 4 with the march of freedmen through the frost-bitten valley, their chains clattering like hollow bells. Erik said, "Every step north is a step into Hakon's teeth." Leif replied, "Teeth can be broken if struck at the root." Edda lifted her staff, murmuring, "Roots run deeper than men see, but storms rip even roots." Sigrid's eyes flickered in the torchlight, and the narrator bound doubt to her silence. She said, "Storms leave nothing standing. not even vows. Erik's voice cut cold. Then vows must stand taller than storms. The air carried the taste of ash, and the narrator traced the smoke curling from the hall beyond the ridge. Leif said, "The forge is quiet now, too quiet." Erik muttered, "Quiet halls hold sharpened knives." The narrator set the valley in shadow, heavy with dread. The narrator drew them into the forest edge where crows circled low, their wings black against pale sky. Leif said, "Crows gather where blood will spill." Edda answered, "They are prophets without tongues." Erik said, "Then they scream with wings instead." Sigrid watched the flock with narrowed eyes, and the narrator tied her silence to unease. She said, "Perhaps they gather for us, not Hakon." Erik's voice hardened, "Then let them eat well when he falls." A distant horn cracked the silence, and the narrator folded fear into the air. Leif said, "He knows we come." Erik said, "Good, let him wait." Edda whispered, "Waiting sharpens the blade before it cuts." The forest swallowed their words, leaving only wings above. The narrator set them against a frozen river crossing, ice cracking under each step like bones breaking. Leif said, "One misstep and the river swallows us." Erik answered, "Better river's mouth than Hakon's hall unready." Edda tapped her staff lightly, whispering, "Ice remembers every footfall, and it punishes haste." Sigrid's lips curved faintly, and she said, "Perhaps it punishes pride more than haste." Erik's jaw tightened, and the narrator wrapped silence around the tension. The ice groaned like a beast beneath them. Leif muttered, "The river sings of death." Erik said, "Then we sing louder." The narrator cracked the stillness with the sound of splintering frost carrying danger across the water. The narrator placed them at a ruined watchtower where banners once flew, now shredded and blackened. Erik said, "This was ours once, now it reeks of Hakon's hand." Leif spat. "He takes stone the way he takes men, breaks them for his own." Edda brushed her hand against the charred wall, whispering, "Ash tells truths no tongue dares." Sigrid stepped forward and said, "Stone can be claimed again, if we have the will." Erik said, "Will without blood is breath wasted." The narrator carried the sound of distant drums rolling through the tower's hollow. Leif said, "He marches closer." Erik said, "Then we meet him not as prey but as storm." The narrator cast long shadows across the ruin, binding the vow to its broken walls. The narrator sealed Act 4 with the circle of freedmen gathered around Erik, their eyes burning with hunger for vengeance. Erik said, "Hakon's shadow ends where our silence ends." Leif raised his spear, shouting, "Then let silence break now." Edda lifted her staff and whispered, "Oaths bind tighter when spoken together." Sigrid's gaze swept the circle, her lips curling into a thin smile, and she said, "Oaths bind, but they also choke." Erik answered, "Better to choke on truth than breathe lies." The narrator carried the chant of voices as the men struck their weapons against stone. A storm born in sound. The valley trembled as if it too remembered war, and the narrator set the vow aflame with fire no water could quench. The narrator opened Act 5 with the night cloaked in silence, only broken by the howl of wolves circling the ridge. Erik said, "The wind carries warning, not welcome." Leif scanned the darkness and muttered, "Shadows move like men, not beasts." Edda raised her staff and whispered, "The dead do not howl, yet the living do." Sigrid's voice cut the quiet. "Perhaps the dead are closer than you think." Erik's eyes narrowed, and the narrator laced suspicion into his silence. He said, "Your tongue sharpens itself too often." Sigrid smirked faintly. "Better sharp than dull in war." The wolves fell silent, replaced by the crack of distant drums. Leif said, "Hakon waits beyond the ridge." Erik answered, Then let him wait until our vow cuts his throne apart. The narrator let the sound of drums sink into the earth like thunder buried deep. The narrator brought them into the hollow where the ground bore fresh graves marked with crude stakes. Leif whispered, "These were dug in haste, not honor." Edda's eyes darkened. Unhallowed earth breeds unrest. Erik's voice carried steel. Hakon buries fast because he fears what lingers. Sigrid knelt by a grave, her fingers brushing the frozen earth, and she said, "Fear feeds quicker than fire." Erik's jaw tightened, and the narrator planted doubt like seed in frozen soil. Leif said, "Do we pass in silence or speak for them?" Edda whispered, "Silence speaks louder when it carries respect." Erik lowered his blade, bowing his head, and the narrator bound his vow to the unmarked dead. The graves seemed to whisper as the wind cut across, and silence carried more weight than steel. The narrator carried them into a ruined barn by the valley's edge where whispers of betrayal stirred. Erik said, "This place smells of ash and treachery." Leif scanned the shadows and muttered, "Eyes watch us from cracks." Edda placed her staff against the ground, whispering, "Walls remember screams longer than ears do." Sigrid leaned against the broken beam. Her voice edged, "Perhaps walls also remember lies." Erik's stare burned into her, and the narrator hung silence heavy as steel between them. Leif said, "If this place hides secrets, we should strip them bare." Erik said, "Secrets are meant to be dragged into fire." The boards groaned under their steps, and the narrator tied betrayal to the broken rafters. The barn creaked, echoing with ghosts, as truth loomed closer with every silence. The narrator set firelight into the clearing where freed men gathered, their voices heavy with unrest. Erik said, "Hakon's chains broke, but his shadow still binds." Leif raised his spear. "Then we cut shadow with storm." Edda said, "Storm without wisdom drowns the foolish." Sigrid's eyes narrowed, and she said, "Wisdom often shelters cowards." Erik turned sharply, and betrayal shelters none. The narrator let silence bite deeper than words. One freed man muttered, "Who speaks truth here?" Erik's voice roared, "Truth is carried by steel, not whispers." The men struck their weapons to the ground, and the narrator marked their unity fragile as ice. Edda whispered, "Vows can bind or break." Erik's eyes hardened. This vow breaks him before it breaks us. The narrator sealed Act 5 with revelation under starlight, when a captive's whisper betrayed truth. Freedman said, "Sigrid spoke with Hakon's guard before we fled." Silence cracked like ice, and Erik's stare fixed on her. Sigrid said, "Words are not oaths," Leif shouted. "You led us blind." Edda raised her hand, whispering, "Even snakes shed skins before they strike." Erik's voice carried thunder. "Truth cuts deeper than lies, and yours bleeds now." Sigrid's lips curved. "Perhaps lies are weapons sharper than vows." The narrator bound suspicion to the circle as steel rang faint in the night. Erik said, "Then the vow stands against both Hakon and betrayal within." The night grew heavier, and the narrator turned trust to ash. The narrator opened Act 6 with the clash of war drums rolling through the frozen night, shaking the valley like thunder. Erik said, "The time for silence is over." Leif raised his spear and shouted, "Then let storm answer storm." Edda whispered, "Steel speaks louder when guided by wisdom." Sigrid's smile curved in the torchlight. "Wisdom bends to those who win." Erik glared, and the narrator fastened betrayal into his stare. He said, "Win or fall, the vow breathes through steel." Freed men struck their weapons on shields, and the narrator spun the valley into storm. Leif said, "The ridge will see blood before dawn." Erik said, "Then dawn will rise red." The narrator pressed the night heavy with dread and fire. The narrator carried them into the clash, where shields thundered and steel sparked. Erik roared for the vow, His sea axe cut into Hakon's warriors, blood spraying like fire in the snow. Leif shouted, "Break their line!" Edda's voice cut through, "Do not lose yourselves to rage." Sigrid's blade struck swift, her eyes glinting with secrets, and the narrator tied suspicion into her every move. Erik said, "Storm them harder or be drowned." Warriors crashed against warriors, the valley echoing with cries. Leif said, "We drive them back." Erik answered, "Not back. Down!" The narrator set the ground trembling under the weight of the battle's fury. The narrator revealed Hakon stepping from the smoke, his eyes burning colder than steel. Hakon shouted, "Exile ends in the grave." Erik answered, "Your throne ends in ash, Hakon." Leif braced beside him, muttering. He looked stronger than stone itself. Edda's voice cut sharp. "Stone crumbles when water finds its cracks." Sigrid's gaze lingered on Hakon, lips curling in recognition, and the narrator froze betrayal in that glance. Erik said, "You took honor. Now I take blood." Hakon raised his axe high, roaring blood feeds the crown. The narrator bound the clash of leaders to fate's edge, where silence broke forever. The narrator poured fire into steel as Erik and Hakon clashed, blades ringing like thunder. Erik grunted, "Your lies end here." Hakon roared, "Lies build thrones. Fool!" Their weapons met, sparks bursting. Leif lunged at a guard, shouting, "Erik, strike him down!" Edda lifted her staff, chanting, "Strength lies not in rage, but in resolve." Sigrid moved closer, her blade aimed not at Hakon, but at Erik's side, and the narrator set, "Betrayal sharp as steel." Erik twisted, forcing Hakon back, unaware of the blade behind him. The narrator wove tension into every breath of fire and frost. The narrator sealed Act 6 with betrayal unveiled as Sigrid's blade slashed, cutting Erik's arm. Erik staggered, growling. "You!" Sigrid whispered. "Lies keep me alive!" Leif shouted. "Snake!" Edda cried. "Betrayal bleeds deeper than steel." Hakon laughed, roaring, even his own bleed him dry. Erik gritted his teeth, blood staining snow. "My vow bleeds louder than your crown." Freedmen shouted in fury, their cries shaking the valley. Leif rushed to Erik's side, shouting, "Stand or we fall." The narrator closed with blood dripping on snow, betrayal burning brighter than fire, and the vow standing on the edge of ruin. Dawn bled over the ridge, and the narrator held breath between blade and oath. Erik wrapped his wound and said, "Pain is a tax. The vow will pay." Leif answered, "Then we collect Hakon's crown." Edda whispered, "Do not spend blood where truth would do." Sigrid watched the light crawl across the snow, her eyes flint. Sigrid said, "Truth without steel is only wind." Erik said, "Steel serves truth, not the other way." The chorus of freed men thinned to a grim hush, and the narrator set fate upon the path. Leif said, "We finish this before the sun climbs." Erik said, "We finish it because it must end." The narrator led them to the shattered gates where banners hung like flayed skins. Hakon strode out, laughter hard as iron. Hakon said, "Come, exile, bow to the throne you abandoned." Erik said, "Thrones built on bones fall quickest." Leif muttered, "Hold the line and strike low." Edda murmured, "Let pride stumble first, then strike true." Sigrid's hand hovered at her hilt, and the narrator trapped the air with doubt. Sigrid said, "Choose quickly, or the day will choose you." Erik said, "I choose the end of your crown." Hakon raised his axe, and silence shattered. Steel rang like thunder, and the narrator bound every heartbeat to the clash. Erik said, "Your crown bought with chains ends now." Hakon answered, "Crowns are paid for in blood, not pity." Leif drove in from the flank and shouted, "Break his knees." Edda cried, "Guard your breath before pride steals it." Sigrid stepped between arcs of blade, eyes bright with secret fire. Sigrid said, "I cut what serves me." Erik said, "Then cut fear." The blows hammered and the narrator weighed the day on a knife's edge. The narrator turned the sky to iron as Sigrid's blade flashed toward Erik, then veered to bite Hakon's wrist. Blood leapt, and the axe fell. Sigrid said, "I serve the winner, not the tyrant." Hakon roared. "Traitor!" Erik held his ground and said, "Then serve the vow." "Not me." Leif yelled, now ended. Edda breathed, "Mercy is the blade that cuts both ways." Hakon staggered, pride louder than pain. Erik said, "Yield the hall, yield the lives you took." The narrator measured silence, waiting for the crown to choose. The narrator closed the circle as Hakon sank to one knee, breath ragged. Hakon said, "Take the hall, exile, and choke on it." Erik answered, "I take back breath for those you stole." Leif said, "Say the word and we end him." Edda's voice softened, "Let justice outlive rage." Sigrid wiped her blade and said, "Crowns wander, oaths remain." Erik lowered steel. Erik said, "Live without crown, live with your shame." The freedmen roared, the hall shuddered, and the narrator sealed the vow with quiet stronger than thunder.